Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in.
Okay, happy Monday everybody. I trust you had a restful weekend and as always have a productive week ahead. My voice is still recovering, so once again my apologies for the audio quality. It should be right in a few days. The calls for stronger government stimulus continue as we move into the new week. As we have seen in recent months, through data, both official and unofficial, across almost every metric, China's previously hoped post-COVID economic rebound is prematurely slowing. Being the first year of Xi Jinping's controversial third term, obtaining the official growth target will be critical in 2023. However, analysts warn that without greater fiscal support, this may not be possible, and that monetary easing is not enough. Quote, "The country's sluggish economy is not a result of high interest rates, but rather constrained infrastructure and real estate investment. As the transmission of monetary policy is blocked, lowering short-term interest rates may not necessarily stimulate financing and investment in the real economy, but lead financial risks to grow instead." End quote. In addition to this concern, central bankers know too that cutting aggressively as global interest rates rise may put too much pressure on the yuan, which is already very low against the US dollar. As we have also seen, while some support has come, Beijing appears deeply hesitant to turn back to the fiscal and credit taps. This isn't surprising. We know that two of the biggest systemic crises policymakers are trying to work through, namely the property sector and local government fiscal health, would both be greatly exacerbated by large-scale stimulus. So far, the People's Bank of China has cut rates, but fiscal measures remain modest, and a recent State Council meeting only disappointed, with the body stating that it would do more research into how to increase consumption in the economy, but without giving any further details or dates. In recent weeks, even state media and senior officials have been calling for economic stimulus, reminding us once again that the Chinese government is not a monolith, but rather made up of competing interests and cliques. For example, late last week, China's 3 main state-run securities newspapers all ran front-page stories calling for more support for the real economy. Then, yesterday, Sunday, in a notable move, Ning Jizhe, deputy head of the Economic Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, CPPCC, and a former vice head of the powerful National Development and Reform Commission, speaking at a press event, urged his government that, quote, "It is better to introduce measures sooner rather than later," end quote, and that these measures needed to be large in order to avoid, quote, "an economic spiral contraction," end quote. Analysts warn that the markets may need to wait until at least the July meeting of the party's Politburo, where economic policy is expected to be discussed, before we know the degree and nature of any stimulus in the second half of the year. However, some banks, especially overseas, are telling clients that they are confident that stimulus will come in the second half of the year. For example, in a note last week, Morgan Stanley economists said, quote, "Policy easing is imminent and necessary," end quote, arguing that Beijing will continue to roll out rate cuts on the monetary side, while also widening the fiscal deficit by expanding government bond quotas, announcing more infrastructure investment, providing tax incentives to support high-end manufacturing, and easing home purchase restrictions. Regular viewers will know that while these moves likely will help in the short term, they once again are very much part of that old growth playbook, which progressively is giving Beijing far less bang for its buck. However, policymakers in Beijing may feel that they don't have any other choice, because if they don't do anything, there could be a worse result. Quote, "The double whammy of depressed consumption and investment is raising fears of long-term stagnation similar to Japan's lost decade in the 1990s following a real estate crash, when annual economic growth averaged just 1%. Beijing has tighter administrative controls, and it can probably avoid a sudden property price correction or messy bursting of debt bubbles. Yet, without action, China risks slowly slipping into the same outcome." End quote. Next up, India strikes a deal with the US for military hardware and China's vision for its new world order.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit that like button. It's just me making these episodes every day. It's a lot of work, but your guys' support is a huge source of motivation. Subscribing and sharing is a huge help as well, and for those who can go the extra mile and help me keep the channel financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support.
Okay, next up, last week Indian leader Modi made a trip to Washington for a state visit. During his meeting with Biden, the two sides announced moderately sized defense and technology deals, including a purchase of American spy drones produced by U.S. defense contractor General Atomics. The establishment of a $2.75 billion semiconductor assembly and test facility in India by U.S. memory chip maker Micron was also confirmed. During the news conference after their bilateral exchange, Biden told reporters that the partnership between the US and India was, quote, stronger, closer, and more dynamic than any time in history, end quote. And of course, it doesn't take too many experts to figure out what has made the relationship stronger, closer, and more dynamic. It is, of course, a shared strategic concern towards China. Indeed, India's growing anxiety regarding what it considers strategic encroachment from China, both at its northern land border with the Himalayas, as well as in the Indian Ocean, is likely the leading motivation for India's enthusiasm for participating in the so-called Quad security group, which includes India, Japan, Australia, and the US. Quote, our nation's economic and security interests overlap on many of the most pressing issues, especially the growing hostility of the Chinese Communist Party in the Himalayas and in the Indian Ocean. End quote. India has maintained a foreign policy of non-alignment since the Cold War, enjoying fairly warm relations with Russia in order to mutually counterbalance China's presence and influence in Central Asia. Beijing responded to this by developing a close and supportive relationship with Pakistan. India and China share a 3,500-kilometer-long border, which has seen sporadic flare-ups of violence in recent years. And India can compete with China in terms of the intensity of its nationalism at home. Before we move to the next development, one other brief update, since we are on the topic of the Quad security group. Yesterday, Sunday, Australia-based publication, The Australian, reported that Taiwan's Foreign Minister, Joseph Wu, has called on Australia to post a military attaché in Taipei, quote, amid sustained geopolitical tensions with China. End quote. The Taiwanese official told the newspaper that Taipei wished to see Canberra follow the lead of the United States, Japan, and Singapore by stationing a military officer in its de facto embassy, quote, to liaison with local security agencies, end quote. He added that Taipei also wished to post a similar official in the Australian capital. And finally for today, we're going to examine several prominent US and broader Western voices discussing China's Global Security Initiative and Global Development Initiative. These initiatives are parts of what some are calling China's vision for a new world order. On China Update, we've been following discussions of these initiatives and others in Beijing, primarily listening to Chinese voices to get a sense of just how the Chinese themselves view all of this. However, it is also important that we follow the debate surrounding this would-be New World Order in the West generally, and in the US specifically, as Washington is very much in a long-term strategic competition with China, and how it thinks about Chinese policies will influence how it in turn responds to them. Whether these observations we're about to cover are correct or not is up for debate. They are recent Western observations that have been widely shared, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on them in the comments below. Quote, in March 2023, China stunned the world by achieving an unexpected diplomatic breakthrough, the brokering of an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran to restore diplomatic relations. The deal was hailed by Beijing as a successful application of the Global Security Initiative, first proposed by Xi Jinping in April 2022 and further articulated in a February 2023 concept paper, which we covered at the time on China Update. The GSI is a manifesto for an alternative system to the current rules-based international order led by the US and its partners. The GSI has a twin, the Global Development Initiative, which was first outlined at the UN in 2021. But just as the GSI aims to guide discourse on global governance. The GDI's goal is to usurp the international dialogue on the global development agenda. Together, these initiatives are Xi's first attempt to present a more comprehensive vision of a new world order and formulate the ideological backbone for a global governance system that elevates Chinese influence at the expense of American power. End quote. Next up, this is from the most recent edition of Foreign Affairs in an article called "China is Ready for a World of Disorder. America is not." Quote, "In the eyes of Chinese strategists, other countries' search for sovereignty and identity is incompatible with the formation of Cold War-style blocs and will instead result in a more fragmented, multipolar world in which China can take its place as a great power. The US strategy won't work if it amounts to little more than a futile quest to update a vanishing order driven by a nostalgic desire for the symmetry and stability of a bygone era. China, by contrast, is readying itself for a world defined by disorder, asymmetry, and fragmentation. A world that, in many ways, has already arrived. China's leaders have made an audacious strategic bet by preparing for a fragmented world. The CCP believes the world is moving toward a post-Western order, not because the West has disintegrated, but because the consolidation of the West has alienated many other countries. End quote. And finally, quote, "At its core, the GSI rests on a set of principles Beijing labels the 6 commitments. These include security concepts she has long promoted, including comprehensive security, common security, and indivisible security. The latter concept has been used by Putin to justify his invasion of Ukraine. The GSI's rejection of a Cold War mentality, among other pejoratives, thinly masks its sharp critique of American leadership in international security. The GSI can be seen as a key element of China's intensifying challenge to US security governance. Ultimately, Beijing seeks to normalize a role for itself as a source of global security. It is promoting a set of principles for international security to rival the current US-led approach that reinforce Beijing's preferred norms and priorities, particularly the principle of non-interference and the prioritization of strong state authority to preserve domestic security as the bedrock of a new global security order." End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a lovely Monday, have a productive week, and I will see you all tomorrow.